guys, welcome to Wickedly Judged, the podcast dedicated to exposing wrongful convictions and fighting for justice reform in America. I'm Rebecca, your host, and if you're new here, this show is for anyone who believes that justice isn't just a verdict. It's a promise, a process, and far too often, a fight. Here at Wickedly Judged, we shine a light on the cracks in our justice system by sharing the real stories, true life of those who have been wrongfully accused, convicted, and forgotten by the courts. We give a voice to their families, advocates, and survivors who refuse to accept injustice as the end of their story. Before we dive in, a quick thank you to our sponsors, Veteran Alliance, Yarn Therapy for Me, Justin Apron, Liberty First Radio, NDVLB, Prime Ledger Group, JSIL, and Wickedly Judged Justice Activation Project. And a special thanks to JP Verse of Versefire Records, providing our powerful intro and outro music. Your guys' support fuels our mission. Thank you so much for standing with us in the fight to expose wrongful convictions and demanding true justice in America. In the last episode, we focused heavily on the contradictions surrounding the knife, the witness testimony, and the unresolved factual disputes reflected throughout the record. We talked about the problems that appear when different witnesses tell different versions of the same event. We talked about how those differences become especially important when physical evidence does not clearly resolve the case. And we talked about why those contradictions are not just minor details. They matter. But tonight's episode is about something even bigger. Tonight, we're talking about the record itself. Because one of the strongest arguments raised in the motion for leave is not simply that testimony conflicted. It is that meaningful review of the case became nearly impossible because critical records, archived proceedings, and investigative materials were not fully accessible for years. And that matters constitutionally, because appellate review is only meaningful if review courts have access to a complete and accurate record. If important proceedings remain untranscribed, if investigative materials remain buried in the archives, if witness statements, recordings, transcripts, and police materials are never meaningfully reviewed together, then serious questions arise. Questions like, what did prior courts actually even review? What was missing from the picture? Were inconsistencies overlooked because the materials needed to identify them were not available? And most importantly, can a conviction truly receive meaningful appellate review when the record itself was incomplete? That is the issue at the center of tonight's episode. Because in this case, the problem was not just what the record showed. The problem was what the record did not show for years. Before I explain the archived recordings, I think people need to understand why preliminary hearings matter so much. Because many listeners may hear the phrase preliminary hearing or pretrial hearing and assume it is just another routine court date. It is not. A preliminary hearing can be one of the earliest moments when witnesses testify under oath. That matters because the timing matters. These hearings often happen much closer to the actual event. Memories may be fresher. Witnesses may not have repeated their stories as many times. Narratives may not yet be shaped by months or years of conversations, preparation, media attention, or pressure. And that early testimony can become incredibly important later. Because when a witness says one thing shortly after the incident and then says something meaningfully different at trial, that difference matters. It can affect credibility. It can affect impeachment. It can affect how the fact finder understands the case. And in post-conviction review, it can affect whether courts believe prior proceedings fully and fairly considered the evidence. That is why discovering that these proceedings had remained untranscribed for years was so significant. Because once those recordings were finally recovered and reviewed, they became another opportunity to compare witness narratives across time. Not just what was said at trial, but what was said before trial. What changed? What stayed the same? What became more certain later? What became less clear? And when witness narratives evolve in major factual areas, that matters constitutionally, especially in a case heavily dependent on testimony alone. One of the most shocking discoveries in this case involved the preliminary hearing and arraignment proceedings. For years, those proceedings had never been transcribed. Think about that. Proceedings connected to a homicide prosecution sitting in the archives, untranscribed, for 17 years. Not reviewed in a way that they should have been. Not compared fully against trial testimony, and not placed neatly alongside the rest of the record. Eventually, after extensive efforts, contact was made with Middletown Municipal Court, and during that process, archived recordings were located. Those recordings had to be recovered from archive systems before transcripts could even be created. Now pause for a second and think about what that means procedurally. Because prior proceedings, prior filings, and prior appellate efforts occurred without those transcripts ever being meaningfully reviewed. That becomes more than just a paperwork problem. It becomes a due process problem. Because meaningful appellate review depends on access to the complete record. And when portions of the record remain inaccessible for years, the integrity of the review process itself comes into question. The issue is not simply that the transcripts were difficult to find. The issue is that their absence may have affected the ability to identify contradictions, preserve arguments, challenge testimony, and present the full factual landscape to the review courts. In a case where liberty is on the line, the record cannot be treated like an afterthought. The record is the foundation. And when the full foundation is not there, it begins to crumble. And that makes everything built on top of it vulnerable, including the conviction itself. Then there is another issue that complicated the case enormously. Some of the witness statements, interrogation tapes, and investigative materials were ultimately located under the victim's name. Again, that may not sound dramatic to everyone listening, but when families are attempting to reconstruct a case years later, organization and accessibility matter tremendously. Because if the records are buried, archived, mislabeled, scattered, or stored across different systems, meaningful review becomes much harder. And in a case like this case, meaningful review depends on comparison. You cannot fully evaluate contradictions if you do not have all of the statements. You cannot track how a witness's story changed if you only have one version of the story. You cannot understand whether trial testimony was consistent with earlier statements that were made if those earlier statements are sitting somewhere else, under another name, in another archive, or in a format no one has reviewed in years. That is why this matters. Because once these materials were finally compared side by side with the trial transcripts, serious contradictions emerged. Conflicting witness narratives, conflicting descriptions of the knife, conflicting descriptions of disposal of the weapon, conflicting descriptions of who saw what, where, and when, conflicting timelines, and conflicting levels of certainty. And those contradictions became central to the constitutional concerns raised in the motion for leave. Because the question becomes, if these materials had been accessible earlier, would the case have been reviewed differently? Would the outcome have been different? Would prior counsel have raised different arguments? Would appellate courts have seen a different factual picture? Would credibility disputes have looked more serious? Those are not small questions. Those are exactly the kind of questions that post-conviction review is supposed to confront. Another major issue involved comparing the witness statements and recovered materials directly against the trial transcripts. Because once those records were finally lined up next to each other, the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Different witnesses described different timelines, different witness locations, different levels of certainty, different sequence of events, different descriptions of what happened before, during, and after the incident. And remember, this was not a case with overwhelming physical evidence resolving these disputes. The alleged murder weapon was never recovered. Forensic findings reflected limitations and incomplete DNA results. There were unresolved questions surrounding the knife itself. There were disputes surrounding witness testimony. And when a case depends heavily on human memory, human perception, and human credibility, consistency becomes critical. Not because every witness must remember every detail perfectly. That's not realistic. But because major factual shifts in testimony matter. A witness changing a minor detail is one thing. A witness changing something central to the alleged events is another. And when those changes are not fully examined because the relevant records were inaccessible or untranscribed, appellate review becomes incomplete. That is why the recovered materials matter so much. They allowed the record to be viewed in a fuller way, not perfectly, not easily, but more completely than it had been before. And that fuller view raised serious concerns about whether prior proceedings had ever truly considered the whole case. One thing that is difficult to fully explain to people who have never gone through this process is just how long it can take to even figure out what records exist. People sometimes imagine that a criminal case file is one complete organized thing, one box, one folder, one clean record. But that is not often reality, especially years later, decades later. This was not a situation where boxes of evidence were simply handed over, already neatly organized. This became years of public records requests, dead ends, archive systems, phone calls, transcript requests, locating old recordings, and trying to piece together fragments of a case that had been spread across multiple systems for years. And emotionally, that process is exhausting. Because every time you uncover another transcript, another witness statement, another recording, another piece of the file, you are forced to go back and relive it all over again. You're forced to compare testimony again. You are forced to ask more questions. And you are forced to confront the possibility that important information may have been sitting somewhere all along, unseen, unreviewed, or disconnected from the larger picture. That is a brutal realization because families already carry the emotional weight of the conviction. Then on top of that, they are asked to become investigators, archivists, researchers, record custodians, legal assistants. They are asked to track down the very materials that should have been preserved, accessible, and available for meaningful review. And eventually, one of the most disturbing realizations was this. Prior proceedings had occurred without some of these materials ever being meaningfully analyzed side by side. That realization became central to the motion for leave, because appellate review is only meaningful if the record being reviewed is actually and factually complete. This is where a lot of people misunderstand post-conviction litigation. People often assume appeals are simply about arguing innocence again. But appellate and post-conviction review are often about process, about due process, access to court records, constitutional fairness, about whether meaningful review actually occurred. And one of the major questions raised by the motion for leave is whether earlier proceedings ever truly had the benefit of the complete record. That is a serious question. Because if critical proceedings remained untranscribed for years and important investigative materials were later discovered in archives, that changes the landscape of the review significantly. It does not automatically determine the outcome, and it does not automatically prove every claim, but it absolutely raises questions that deserve meaningful examination. Because the justice system cannot say a case has been fully reviewed if key pieces of the record were missing from that review. It cannot say contradictions were adequately considered if the materials revealing those contradictions were not meaningfully compared. And it cannot treat procedural finality as more important than constitutional fairness when the record itself was incomplete. That is the heart of this issue. The question is not only whether mistakes were made, the question is whether the system had everything it needed to recognize those mistakes when it mattered. And beyond the legal arguments, there is a human cost here, because incomplete records do not just affect court filings. They affect families. They affect years of waiting, years of unanswered questions, years of trying to understand why something does not add up, but not having the documents needed to prove it. That is one of the most painful parts of post-conviction work. Sometimes the truth is not hidden in one explosive document. Sometimes it is buried across dozens of pages, old recordings, partial transcripts, inconsistent statements, and procedural gaps. Sometimes it takes years just to assemble enough of the record to show that the original review was never complete. And by that time, years or even decades have passed. Lives have changed. Evidence has grown older. Memories have faded. People have moved on. But the person convicted is still living with the consequences. The family is still searching for the truth. And the record is still the battleground. That is why this matters. Because access to records is not a technicality. It is part of fairness, part of accountability, part of transparency, part of the promise that convictions can be tested, reviewed, and challenged when serious constitutional concerns arise. Tonight's episode was not just about missing records. It was about why complete records matter. Because justice systems cannot meaningfully review convictions without meaningful access to the materials connected to those convictions. And when records remain buried, archived, scattered, or inaccessible for years or even decades, families are left fighting uphill battles just trying to understand what actually happened, how the system failed so badly. This case raises a deeply important question. What happens when the record needed to challenge a conviction was never fully available in the first place? And that question does not have an easy answer. But it deserves to be asked, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Because due process is not supposed to depend on whether a family can spend years hunting through archives. Meaningful review should mean meaningful review, not partial review, not delayed review, not review based on an incomplete picture. In the next episode, we're going to talk about something that most people never truly understand until they live it themselves. The appellate process, the motions, the procedural barriers, the delays, the exhaustion, and why wrongful conviction litigation becomes one of the hardest legal battles imaginable. Visit wickedlyjudged.com to stay updated, share the episodes, support our investigations, purchase merchandise, or donate to help fund wrongful conviction advocacy and post-conviction review efforts. Don't let these stories end just because this episode is over. If you believe in the work that we're doing, here's how you can help us right now. Follow Wickedly Judged wherever you listen to podcasts. Share this episode with someone who cares about truth and accountability. Follow us on social media. Leave a review. It's one of the fastest ways to help more people find these cases. If you happen to share a post on social media, tag us so we can thank you and amplify the conversation. And if you're able to support the mission directly, please donate to help fuel our investigations, advocacy, and education efforts. Or support the work by grabbing merchandise at wickedlyjudged.com. Every share, review, donation, and purchase helps us keep pushing for real justice reform. As always, stay informed, stay vigilant, and stay hopeful, because nobody deserves to be wickedly judged.